On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is The Young Girls of Rochefort, followed by my segment Allow Me to Explain, and it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is The Young Girls of Rochefort, released in 1967, directed by Jacques Demy, starring Catherine Deneuve, Daniel Derieux, Georges Chiquires, Michel Piccoli, François Doliac, and Gene Kelly. Here is the synopsis of the film. Twin sisters Solange, played by François Doliac, and Delphine, played by Catherine Deneuve, are working as a music instructor and a dance teacher, hoping to find a romantic man or men away from the city of Rochefort. When a couple of touring carnival singers, played by Grover Dale and Georges Chiquires, Bill and Etienne, their character names in the film, are in need of a double act for their show, they decided they would be perfect, and this is addressing to Delphine and Solange, to be a part of the show with their musical talent. It is a story of missed opportunities, second chances, and show-stopping numbers for this feature film from Jacques Demy. What do I think of the film? I enjoyed the energy coming from these musical numbers from the mind of Jacques Demy as he writes the songs for each character in the film as they are introduced, such as Delphine and Solange's song describing themselves as Gemini twins, to an imaginary man or woman that Delphine and another character in the story, Maxence, played by Jacques Perrin, dream of as their ideal match in the story. I admire Norman Main's choreography paired with the wonderful costume work by Marie-Claude Fouquet and Jacqueline Moreau to capture the saturated colors in the world of Jacques Demy. I feel drawn into the city of Rochefort thanks to the use of saturated colors and the production design by Bernard Even, such as the dance studio where the twin sisters live and rehearse with their dance class, to the music shop where Simone Dame, played by Michel Piccoli, resides. When you listen to the songs put in the score by the great Michel Legrand, who was a collaborator for the great Jacques Demy, as well as other French New Wave filmmakers during this period, you become drawn into the narrative as it unfolds on the screen. Catherine Deneuve and her real-life sister François Doliac worked really well as the twin sisters in the film with their witty charm and playful acting as I watched the film from beginning to end as we are introduced to their characters from a crane shot to a tracking shot courtesy of cinematographer Ghislaine Cloquet. Other actors who appear in the film in the supporting cast include Danielle Derieux as their mother in the film who owns a cafe in the middle of the town square, who is good in this film in her superb acting style, Jacques Perrin, as I mentioned earlier, who plays the role of Maxence, the painter who is looking for the ideal woman whom he wants to be with as the match, Michel Piccoli as the music store owner Simone Dame, who had been married before to a woman whom he had not seen for many years, Grover Dale and Georges Chiquires as Bill and Etienne, as I mentioned earlier, are the carnival workers who arrive in the town of Rochefort to provide entertainment and are smitten in love with Delphine and Solange, and Gene Kelly as American concert pianist Andy Miller, who was supposed to play in Paris and is later reunited with his friend Simone Dame, but he is love-struck and charmed by Solange in the film. As I have noted before in the previous podcast episodes about the work of Jacques Demy, one of the recurring motifs that is present is his use of saturated colors in production design and costuming to be useful to the story of the film, but also the continuity of having his characters from his previous work be used in his other films. And this film makes references to The Umbrellas of Cherbourg and the other Lola from 1961 and another reference to The Bay of Angels from 1963. So I consider this one of my favorite international movie musicals by Jacques Demy in this review. After the success of his previous film, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg from 1964, Demy set forth to create a companion piece as part of a loose trilogy. He wanted to up the ante by making his next film an homage to the Hollywood movie musicals that he loved and admired. But he also wanted to present the film with a French taste and also use classical music in the story as well. Demy wanted to bring back the same collaborators from his previous feature for his next project. Next, he needed to find the right location for his story. He and his location manager searched around the country of France for the right city based on the architecture that would be part of the story. The last location for the cities that they came across is the city of Rochefort that became part of the story and the title of the movie, The Young Girls of Rochefort. For its militaristic architecture and design, Demy originally wanted Gene Kelly when he was working on this project, but he had to wait for 2 years since he had prior commitments to other projects and he was unavailable to appear in the film. When Kelly was available, he was cast in this movie. Another connection to the Hollywood movie musical was the casting of George Chakiris, fresh off his success from the film West Side Story. Chakiris recalled that instead of being offered a script for a role in this movie, Demy and Michel Legrand played the entire score and the songs for him. Chakiris' manager recommended to him that he should not take the role since it would not be a great performance. Chakiris to the Los Angeles Times, quote, "I liked the sound of it myself, so I chose to go ahead and do it. I just think it's a film that holds up. It has such charm," end quote. Demy and his producer, Mag Bodard, along with the involvement of Gene Kelly, were able to get financial backing from Warner Brothers. Before filming began, François Dorléac and Catherine Deneuve were practicing in England with choreographer Norman Maine on the dance and musical numbers, in which they had to practice their choreography moves and lip-sync to the pre-recorded music for the film. Filming began in the summer of 1966 in the city of Rochefort. For this film, Demy was given twice the budget from his previous film, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. That he was able to use the different techniques such as crane shots, dolly shots, and other elaborate camera placements that he was unable to use in his previous films. Demy realized that since his previous film was more pessimistic in tone and story, that he decided to make the story more optimistic and as a tribute/homage to the Hollywood movie musicals which he adored, by using musical numbers that would be mixed in the dialogue sequences as a Hollywood tradition. Demy had a conversation with production designer Bernard Evin to paint all the window shutters with bright saturated colors such as blue, pink, purple, yellow, red, and other colors that would fit Demy's color scheme for his vision. Demy and producer Mag Bodard thought that by filming 2 different versions of this film, one in French and the other in English, it would be successful in the United States. Demy was once again collaborating with Michel Legrand for this next project. He recalled on his collaboration with Demy in an interview, quote, "I remember arriving at Demy's house in the mornings to work together. He would stand by the piano with a blank notepad and I would have a blank music sheet in front of me over the keyboard. I would say to myself, for the moment, nothing exists. But after about an hour or maybe a day or a week, all these sheets will be filled and we will have created something new. On occasions, all that was necessary was quick riff on the piano to set the creative process in motion," end quote. Just as Dorléac was making it as an international star, she was killed in a tragic car accident that took her life at 25 years of age. Her last film after The Young Girls of Rochefort was Billion Dollar Brain, also released in 1967 with Michael Caine. Her sister, Catherine Deneuve, would go on to have a long and prolific career as an international star and one of France's most esteemed actresses in the film industry. Deneuve had told in 2 separate interviews on looking back on the film and the memory of seeing her sister on the screen. She told the New York Times, quote, "It's less difficult to watch this film than with others with my sister. It was the only film I did with her, but it was a musical. The scenes are so charming and related to what we are as sisters in real life," end quote. In another interview, she said, quote, "We were very close, and shooting that film brought us even closer, back to a place and way we had been when we were much younger. Life can give you some terrible knocks, and there's not a happy ending every time, but I do believe in them. I am very optimistic. I am still very romantic about life," end quote. The film was released on March 8, 1967 in France and was a commercial and critical success. The English-language dubbed version was released in the United States on April 11, 1968, and was a commercial failure. The film garnered an Oscar nomination for Best Score, but lost to the movie Oliver. More than 30 years after its release, Agnès Varda, widow of Jacques Demy, led the restoration of her husband's films, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg and The Young Girls of Rochefort, since the Eastman color film stock was starting to fade and wear out badly. Varda was on the set of the film and recorded behind-the-scenes footage on 16mm film that was later incorporated in the documentary The Young Girls Turn 25 from 1993. The film was later re-released on August 14, 1998, in the United States for its 30th anniversary. Some of the last things that I will say about this film is that as I am watching it, it does feel like I am watching a Hollywood movie musical, except that it feels a little more French and classical in tone and content. The only thing that feels different about this film is that when I see actors like Gene Kelly, George Chakiris, or Grover Dale have their voices dubbed by French actors off camera, it feels odd than when I hear their actual voices on screen. I am a fan of Demy's choices for his color scheme that create his world, and while some of the scenes in the film I felt were lagging, such as some dialogue scenes, I felt that this is one of my favorite international movie musicals that I enjoyed from beginning to end. We will be right back with Allow Me to Explain. In October, the Supreme Court took up the case named Gonzalez v. Google. The case will focus on the little-known tech law that has barely got any attention in our mainstream media, Section 230. The Supreme Court set a date for the upcoming case on February 21st, with another case related to Section 230 on February 22nd, known as Twitter v. Tomne. So, how did we get here, and why has the tech law become so political recently on both sides of the aisle? It's time for Allow Me to Explain. One of the most important cases in this Supreme Court term next month is whether or not social media companies will no longer have the shield to protect themselves from lawsuits for content put on their platforms by internet users. Recently, both parties in Congress have been targeting Section 230, but for two different reasons. The Democratic lawmakers' argument is that there are bad actors on the platform that have spread misinformation and hate speech, and that big tech has deflected its responsibility of rooting out bad misinformation and hate speech on their platforms. The Republican lawmakers' argument is that the big tech companies have censored conservative voices or talking points on their platforms. On one side, Democratic lawmakers propose to moderate online content targeting hate speech and misinformation, while Republican lawmakers want to apply First Amendment rights to social media sites. Before we dive into the Supreme Court case, I thought it would be great to break it up into three sections of what is Section 230 and what is its main purpose, why was it created, and the recent opposition to Section 230, as well as a failed attempt to undermine this key law. Section 230, also known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, helps protect online companies from liability arising from what is posted on their platforms. In other words, it is the principle that we should be responsible for our own actions and statements online, but generally not those of others, according to Electronic Frontier Foundation. The law was created because in the 1990s, there were a pair of court cases on liability issues that arose in the early years of the Internet, and how the existing U.S. law proved to be ill-equipped. The first case was Cubby v. CompuServe from 1991, in which plaintiff Robert Blanchard, owner of Cubby Incorporated, sued Don Fitzpatrick, who ran his forum Rumorville on CompuServe's platform known as Journalism Forum, of posting allegedly defamatory remarks about his competing news source, Scuttlebutt. The case was heard before the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. The plaintiff argued that CompuServe was responsible as Rumorville's publisher and was liable for Fitzpatrick's statements on its platforms. CompuServe argued, along with the defendant Don Fitzpatrick, that it had no first-hand knowledge of the contents of Rumorville, its publication, and no opportunity to review the newsletter's contents. The court sided with CompuServe and ruled that it was a distributor and not a publisher, and was not liable for the statements published in Rumorville. The second case was Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy from 1995, in which Stratton Oakmont Incorporated, the plaintiff, sued the online service Prodigy Services Company, the defendant, when an anonymous user posted offensive statements on Prodigy's Money Talk bulletin board about Daniel Porush and his brokerage firm Stratton Oakmont. Prodigy had put out a set of guidelines for user-generated content, and like the previous court case, the New York Supreme Court held that Prodigy was a publisher and not a distributor and was liable for defamatory statements posted on its bulletin board. Then Representatives Chris Cox a Republican from California, and Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, wanted to come up with a meaningful legislation that would counter to these decisions on how the internet should operate. Their solution was a bipartisan legislation that would encourage free speech online and allow online services to engage in content moderation without fear of liability. They introduced the amendment to the legislation known as the Communications Decency Act, the CDA, called the Cox-Wyden Amendment. The bill was meant to counter the rise of online pornography by regulating obscenity and indecency online. It was added as part of the large piece of legislation that passed through Congress known as the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was meant to update the U.S. telecommunications law for the first time in over 60 years. The amendment which was added to this large bill was renamed Section 230. The legislation was signed into law by President Bill Clinton on February 8, 1996. On the same day as the bill was signed into law, the ACLU filed a legal challenge on the provisions regarding indecent or offensive content where minors can view it along with the other plaintiffs such as Electronic Frontier Foundation, Planned Parenthood, etc. The case, along with another case challenging those two provisions, ended up on the U.S. Supreme Court. The case became known as Reno v. ACLU from 1997. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the two provisions were unconstitutional and violated the First Amendment of free speech. The recent opposition to Section 230 and why lawmakers in both parties want to reform it happened during the 2016 election and the aftermath as misinformation by foreign actors were meant to shape the media coverage in the United States. And as Senator Mark Warner said in a 2017 hearing with representatives from the big tech companies Google, Facebook, and Twitter, quote, "The social media and innovative tools each of you have developed have changed our world for the better. But Russia's actions are further exposing the dark underbelly of the ecosystem you have created," end quote. It was from that moment that the lawmakers decided on turning its focus on the role of Section 230 and how big tech companies should take their own responsibilities. Senator Ron Wyden in that very same meeting said, quote, "Now you've discussed your response to these attacks, but it is self-evident in relation to the power your platforms now have. In the past election, you failed, and this is especially troubling because the same federal law that allowed your companies to grow and thrive, the Section 230 law, gives you absolute legal protection to take action against those who abuse your platforms to damage our democracy. You've got the power, and Congress has given you the legal protection to actually act and deal with this." One of the bills that was meant to test the boundaries of reforming Section 230 and the topic of sex trafficking was FOSTA, also known as the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, which was meant to combat this issue. Another bill that was passed in Congress was the SESTA, also known as Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, which was meant to combat against sex trafficking. Instead, both these bills threaten free expression by criminalizing sex workers and their allies by putting them in danger. After FOSTA was signed into law, sex workers have reported being subjugated to violence, but were unable to use online platforms for health and safety resources. It is just one of the worst examples of what a bill that is meant to regulate the content on the internet and also what it means when you fail to reform Section 230. So far, lawmakers have introduced dozens of bills in the last Congress that want to hold big tech companies responsible. But when it comes to moderating the content on the platforms or repealing the law itself, lawmakers from both parties are unsure of which direction to go to since both their talking points, as I have mentioned earlier, are different from an ideological standpoint. Which brings us to the two court cases that I have mentioned earlier, Gonzalez v. Google and Twitter v. Tomna, all the more interesting. 2 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to pick up a case regarding the scope of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Justice Clarence Thomas agreed with the rest of the U.S. Supreme Court that it should not hear this case, but as Thomas wrote, quote, "In an appropriate case, the court should not only hear arguments, but begin paring back the sweeping immunity for companies courts have read into Section 230. The case of Gonzalez v. Google asks whether Section 230 shields Google, the owner of YouTube, from being sued by persons alleging that YouTube's algorithms aided the terrorist group ISIS by recommending ISIS videos to viewers," end quote. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth District ruled in favor of Google. The other case, Twitter v. Tomda, involves a separate attack in Turkey and concerns whether the platform Twitter provided material aid to terrorists. So where do we go from here? Well, I won't give you a simple answer, but I would say that the one thing to look at right now is to pay attention to the upcoming cases on February 21st and 22nd as best as you can. And as Corbin Barthold, Internet Policy Council for Tech Freedom said, quote, recommending content to users is classic publisher behavior. It's what a newspaper does when it puts a story on page A1 instead of page D6. To hold a platform liable for how it presents user-generated content is to treat it as a publisher, exactly what Section 230 forbids. He also added, quote, if ISIS had not uploaded videos to YouTube, YouTube would have had no terrorist content to serve up. This is a tell that the plaintiff's suit is really about the user-generated content and is a loser under Section 230, end quote. Since both these cases involve the part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 that has shaped the modern internet, and what it will mean if those protections are taken away in the upcoming court cases. The best way to look at this is to let your friends and family members know about this case, educate them about Section 230, let them know about this law and what it means not just for social media companies, but also for small businesses and startup companies in general. It is an important topic that should not be weaponized, but instead be seen as how you should talk to someone within the tech industry or someone who has been knowledgeable about tech in the first place, and study the questions of how to maintain a perfectly balanced law with economic and social benefits of the algorithms online in a new law instead of making it a scapegoat, which we should address to our lawmakers instead of letting them weaponize it and making it a political scapegoat. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, and Google Podcasts every Friday. Make sure to go to my blog website at filmtalkwithjordanramirezpodcast.wordpress.com with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.